powerful or as mysterious as the human brain. 80 billion neurons wire the brain, and each cell is connected chemically and electrically with 10,000 others. At give or take 100 trillion synapses, the brain is the world's most complex network, loaded with more dynamic interconnections than there are stars and planets in the Milky Way. For nearly all our history, human beings have had nothing but language and gesture to move information out of the brain. And only our sensory organs did pull information in. But what if our brains could communicate directly with each other, bypassing the need for language? Researchers are already proving that brain-to-brain communication is possible. In a first-of-its-kind experiment, signals from one person's brain were transmitted over the internet to control the hand motions of another person within a split second of sending that signal. In another kind of experiment involving human-to-animal communication, scientists were able to take signals from a human brain and transfer them to an animal brain, using signals from the human to the rat's tail. And research in the field of brain-computer interfaces has patients operating complex prosthetic arms solely with the power of their minds. Science has begun to look not only at the brain's anatomy, but also at the way it works in real time, how the interconnections and electrochemical activity generate movement, intellect, and emotion, how we move our eyes and limbs, how we solve certain problems, or even how we fall in love. We may be on the brink of discovering how our minds work as we probe the most complex structures and deepest mysteries of the human brain.
So I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, when is this guy going to get on with it? And I know that because I'm guessing, and I think I'm probably right, at least for some of you, but it's not because I got into your heads or because we had a mind meld. That's something that I can't do, and I think most of you can't do. But what we're actually going to be discussing tonight is the horizon of a world we're approaching in which we have the first glimmers of that being possible. We're going to be talking about new research and developments in technology that actually allow for communication, the passage of information, brain to brain, without words being spoken, without language, without hand signals, without any kind of the usual use of senses to get that information across. It's brain to brain, human brain to human brain, and even human brain to animal brain. And how exciting is that? Or how scary is that? It's all that we're going to be discussing tonight with a panel of scientists who are really, truly at the front edge of this research. They're going to be showing you their experiments, talking about how they work, talking about the pitfalls, talking about the possibilities, and then we are going to be discussing just how much we want all of this to be happening in our lives. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? So warm up your applause lines, your applause moments again, because we're going to be welcoming a series of superb panelists to the stage, beginning first with the distinguished professor of neuroscience at Duke University Medical School and founder of Duke's Center for Neuroengineering. He was first to propose and to demonstrate that animals and human subjects can use electrical brain activity to directly control neuroprosthetic devices via brain-machine interfaces. Please welcome Dr. Miguel Michaelis. Our next guest is an associate professor of psychology at the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences at the University of Washington. Her work focuses on biological constraints on information processing to better understand individual mind-brain relationships. She was named Young Investigator for 2011 by the Society for Text and Discourse. Please welcome Chantal Pratt. Our next speaker is an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Washington, Seattle. He develops computer models of how complex cognitive processes take place in the human brain. He helped develop the first non-invasive direct brain-to-brain interface in humans. Please say hello to Andrea Stocco. Next up, a neuroscientist at Harvard Medical School. He has done early pioneering works in developing real-time functional magnetic resonance imaging that are used to interpret the human mind. He also developed a new mode of non-invasive brain stimulation modality that uses focused ultrasound waves to control regional neural functions. Please welcome Sung-Shik Youre. And also let's bring to the stage a professor of medical ethics and psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical College. He is a past president of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities. His latest book, Rights Come to Mind, explore brain injury ethics, the struggle for consciousness. He also teaches at Yale Law School. Please welcome Dr. Joe Finns. And Joe, before we get started with the scientists, the researchers sitting between us, because as a medical professional, you're also a scientist. You also teach law. You are the bioethicist on the panel. So before we hear about the experiments, give us a little look ahead, a little crib sheet about the things we want to be keeping in mind as we hear where the research is pushing into.
Okay, so we haven't had a brain-to-brain interface yet, so I don't know what they're really thinking. But what I wanted to say, and I think is a kind of a preamble to this, is that there's a real privilege to do science, and there have been historical abuses of science, psychosurgery and the like, a lot of utopianism in the past, a lot of hype that was never realized. So I think my admonition is to keep it real, to keep it focused on human need, and not make it a science project, but make it an effort in the service of humanity, for the good of humanity.
Which doesn't mean, seriously, I'm going to use the term Debbie Downer, which sounds funny, but you're not being a downer about the possibilities.
No, I'm a science hawk. I mean, I was involved in a project that was published in Nature about a decade ago using the first use of deep brain stimulation in the minimally conscious state. And for 15 years, I wrote papers about why I thought we should do that. I'm a science hawk. I want science to progress. But I think it's very important that scientists act responsibly and responsibly at the same time, and I know that my colleagues will do that.
All right, let's look at where the science is taking us. What we have on the panel is arranged in roughly from this end to that, and roughly speaking, chronological order of the development of some of the real groundbreaking research that's been done in this. So we're going to work down in that order. And again, our order is not perfect because you're all doing different projects at different times, but in terms of certain landmarks. And I want to start with you, Miguel. Now, how did you get into just a little biography, how did you get into the mind business?
The mind business, yeah. Getting out of my mind. Yeah, I was in medical school and I started working in research in Brazil. We went to medical school after high school. And in my third year out of 6 years there, in medical school, 6 years.
So you're 16 years old?
I was 17. And you're 17 years old and you're in gross anatomy class. And you meet a neuroscientist. And you just fall in love with what he's talking about the brain. So I went to his lab and started working with him. But at that time, before I went to get my PhD, I realized that people were recording only one electrical signals of only one neuron at a time. That was mid-'80s. And I told to my professor, Dr. Caesar, so this is crazy. It's like trying to understand the rainforest one tree at a time. It's never going to work.
Yeah. And was your professor impressed by your thought, or did he tell you to shut it?
No, he told me I know the perfect place in Brazil to go to do this kind of work, recording many neurons simultaneously. I said, oh, wonderful. You're in São Paulo, in New York, or the Southern Hemisphere. Where should I go? He said, it's called the airport. You go to the airport and you find a crazy American that will buy the idea because you can only do these crazy things over there. And I did find John Chapin, crazy, wonderful man who wanted to do the same thing. That was 88. And people were recording just one single neuron at a time. And John, I wrote a letter in broken English to him, and I said, John, I want to record 100 neurons simultaneously. And he said, well, that's exactly what I want to do. So why don't you come over and join me in Philadelphia? And that's what I did. I came to the city of brotherly love, looking for the brotherly love I never found. I found the Eagles, though.
Okay.
And then we started developing the technology for recording many neurons simultaneously in behaving animals. That was the key, an awake, fully behaving animal.
So we jump to the work that we're going to be talking about tonight. Goes back to what year we're going to be starting with.
Well, we developed this technique in the mid-90s, but in the late 90s, 98, John and I reached the conclusion that to really make our friends in neuroscience understand the power of population coding, we had to develop something new. So in 1999, we published a paper in which rats were using 48 neurons, the electrical storm produced by 48 neurons, to control a robotic lever. Just one-dimensional movement without moving.
This was first time.
That was the first time ever the demonstration of closed loop of an animal. But people said, "Oh, these are just rats. We want to see something more interesting." And that's when we went for monkeys, because that's what is assumed to be the next clear step to demonstrate any technology. And the first clip we have is my favorite monkey, Aurora. She's first playing a video game using a joystick, and she was very good at that. In fact, you can even see how well she tried to cheat it, try to get a target with the cursor inside. And then we soon realized that if we create a link between her brain and that robotic device that you're seeing next to it, we could get Aurora to control the robotic device just by thinking.
So now we're seeing Aurora's using the joystick.
In the beginning.
Her what do you call a monkey's paw? A paw?
A hand.
A hand?
Yeah, a hand, a monkey hand.
Okay.
There's a bit close to us.
Novel called the monkey's paw.
Yeah.
Right? So that hand-like object attached to the monkey is how Aurora is controlled.
Yeah,
so
Aurora was learning with the joystick first. Okay. What you're seeing here is the first time, I like to say, that a primate's brain, if we can have the video again, I'll explain better. But that was the first time a primate's brain liberated itself from the physical limits of the body and was acting in the world. First she's using the joystick. That's the training phase. And we're recording 100 neurons, electrical signals of 100 neurons. We're mixing them up, extracting the motor commands, and sending to the robotic device. And then we took the joystick away. And Aurora realized that she didn't need to move the arm anymore. She could control that device just by imagining the movement.
Okay, so we can't see Aurora. What's Aurora hooked up to? Well, I mean, if we could see Aurora's head.
Oh no, you would see just a cap and some wires coming out, going to the amplifiers, taking these electrical signals to computers and mixing them up.
And what's going on that Aurora, without using her paw hand, is able to? What is the monkey doing?
Yeah, what we demonstrated here is that we could get an animal to realize that it didn't need to produce the overt movement of the body to control the cursor and get a drop of juice. That was the reward she was getting every time she put that cursor inside the target. Okay. She could interact directly with the device and through a brain-machine interface. And the brain-machine interface, I would say, is the grandfather of brain-to-brain, because that's where it always started.
I guess what I'm trying to understand is that Aurora had no, as far as you know, because obviously you can't direct with media, but you're not arguing that Aurora has some sense of, I want to get the juice, I'm going to move the stick. Well, it's more that something more spontaneous, some sort of learning happens.
No, she had to learn, and she realized by trial and error that when we took the joystick away, there was no point of moving the arm. Right? There was no causal linkage between the arm movement and the cursor. Yeah. Somehow she figured out that she could just imagine something, and we were able to record that. And soon she realized, okay, this is the prototype of a free lunch. Right. I don't need to move. I'm just going to get this, 400 ml of juice.
But somehow she figured out.
She figured out.
Know that part yet. You know that she did.
She did because we were recording EMGs over her body, and we could show that for long periods of time she was controlling that without producing.
I just want to go to somebody else on the panel now. Sungshik, you're up at Harvard. The news of what Miguel's doing breaks. Tell us, as a professional, how big a deal was this?
Right. So I still remember the morning. It was around 11 or 10. I was reading my email, and the email started coming up to me and say, "Sungshik, you gotta see this." And there's a news about the Miguel's work. And so the reason that people were sending an email is it's such a striking demonstration of the human's ability to interpret the cellular level neuroactivity and how to interpret it, and then translate it into a computer commands to execute other computer-related commands and robotic controls. So that's an amazing thing like that.
So it was a big deal. It was.
Oh yes.
Do you agree, colleagues?
Yeah,
It was.
absolutely.
Everybody remembers this day. Okay, so you're a big deal.
I do remember today too.
So next step for you, where did you go next?
Yeah, when we saw that, we asked the question, do we need to have the robotic arm or the actuator next to the monkey? Could we have this somewhere else? Could we have that across the planet? So I hooked up with one of my best friends, a roboticist, Gordon Schenk, who at that time was working in Kyoto, ETR Laboratories in Kyoto, and I said, Gordon, would we be able to make our monkeys control your humanoid robot to walk just through a brain-machine interface that goes around the planet? And it has to be quick, it has to be 300 milliseconds. So our monkeys were walking on a treadmill, and we were recording the brain activity and sending it to this humanoid robot, CPU1, and seeing whether the robot could walk under the control of the monkey. And we are projecting exactly this move in front of the monkey, and the monkey would only get reward, a drop of juice, if the monkey steps on the ground on the correct timing. And we turn off the treadmill at Duke, and as long as we keep giving the monkey juice, even though the monkey didn't walk itself, the robot would walk in Japan. So the monkey didn't care there wasn't its own body that was moving or not.
Did the monkey have a visual of the
Yes.
robot?
It had a screen in front of it projecting the images coming in real time from Japan.
So the monkey was aware that the robot's motion was vital to the getting the juice.
Absolutely. The monkey learned that that stepping that you saw there was vital to get the juice. And Gordon really wanted to do that as fast as possible. So now I can review it 10 years later. He broke every firewall between Duke and Kyoto. I don't even know if that was legal or not, but he went through everything and we got that under 300 milliseconds.
And all of the flashing lights and zigzagging lines were just so.
These are brain activity from the monkey. This is the day we recording that, and we got a friend at the New York Times at that time. They didn't believe that could happen, so we put a journalist at Duke and a journalist in Kyoto on the phone, and they were reporting to each other what was going on. So they actually saw the experiment going on.
And this is 100% success rate every monkey, every time?
Well, we tried with 2 monkeys doing that. We published that with 2 monkeys, and they were successful. You know, the 2 monkeys were successful. It's not 100%, but it's very high. It's above 85%. Yes.
Joe, Finn's anything twitching in you as you see this in terms of questions that come to you?
Pretty smart monkey.
She likes to walk.
Yeah. Well, I think it's ironic that the journalists were using another, brain-to-brain interface, a telephone.
Yes, that's funny.
And it brings up the issue of what the great Louis Thomas spoke about, who wrote The Lives of the Cell, and he spoke about halfway technologies.
Exactly.
And these are halfway technologies en route to something more facile, more usable.
I always it reminds me also of Arthur Clarke's famous line that when technology is so above us, it looks like magic. Well, the journalists never saw a neuroscience lab before. When they walk into it and they saw these hundreds of neurons flashing in this robot walking in Japan, they looked like they have, gone to a 2001 kind of movie.
So what was your next step?
Well, when we saw that in 2007, we realized finally that could be done in humans. We are confident that we could use a brain-machine interface to restore locomotion in humans. And I got lucky to be in the right moment, in the right place in Brazil, around 2010, I think, in a meeting. Brazil had been awarded the World Cup, the Soccer World Cup. It's a big deal for Brazilians and most of the world.
Didn't go so well on the field.
Well, let's not talk about soccer. We are science here, right? We are science. So I was in this room and people wanted to do a demonstration, something that was beyond music and soccer, something that would give a message to the whole world of hope. That was the team. And I was sitting in the back room and I said, what about if we have a paraplegic Brazilian using a brain-controlled robotic exoskeleton to deliver the opening kickoff of the World Cup and feel the ball when he kicks? And this is an example of one of our patients that was trained to use a non-invasive technique, EEG, to imagine walking. And these signals basically translated into digital commands that go to a robotic exoskeleton that he's wearing. And not only he can walk with this device, but we have sensors all over the exoskeleton, that one pressure sensors. When he touches the ground, there's a pressure wave that is generated and delivered to a vibrating element on his arm. So his arm is used as a transducer for his brain to imagine movement. So we found a combination of the elements by changing the magnitude and the timing that generated a phantom sensation. You probably heard about phantom limb sensation. They had phantom limbs. We found a way to give them the feeling that it's not the exo that is carrying them, but it's them walking with the exo, and it was very realistic. So this was the device that was used in the opening kickoff.
I remember there was a young guy.
Absolutely, Juliano Pinto. He's paralyzed from T4, from this level down. 2/3 of his body is paralyzed.
For him, was this a one-time only sort of spectacular moment?
No. We have been working with all these 8 patients for 24 months now.
Yeah.
And the most beautiful part is now we know, because we have done neurological examination of these guys, and they have been chronic spinal cord lesions. Yeah. They have been in a wheelchair for a decade. 2 years later, 7 of these patients have recovered sensitivity below the level of the injury and motor control, voluntary motor control of some muscles below the level of the lesion. So I think plasticity was triggered by this exercise of imagining you're walking and getting this feedback that is very realistic. So this conjunction of the output to control a device and the feedback that feels like my body is moving may have triggered axons that were left, nerves that survived the original lesion to start working again.
So far you are showing us the ability to read information out of the brain.
Yes, and send feedback back.
And send feedback.
Yes, and that was happening. The kick was I had published a book, my book Beyond Boundaries, and I had predicted that the next logical step there would be to try to connect brains. And when I published the book, lots of our colleagues said, "Oh, this is never going to happen. It's too crazy." But
did you all say that?
No, not that. They're in the forefront. The more conservative people were saying, no, this is not going to happen. But I had heard the same thing with brain-machine interfaces.
Yeah.
They told us it's never going to happen. So the next step was to try to do that, to try to connect brains of animals. I was working mainly with animals at that beginning. We started working this project in 2012. But by 2013, we had the first paper out. And this was the communication between 2 rats. It was just a proof of concept, but I was very keen to see, one, if it could be done, if animals would understand simple messages that you're sending from one to another, and what would happen to the brains of these animals when they're interacting with one another. Because would they synchronize? Would they work as a whole, as a team? Because I had proposed a concept in that book of building an organic or biological computer. So these are the cartoon of some of these experiments where we are linking rats. These are different designs of that first the experiments. This is actually a paper published later. But first of all, we needed to see how much plasticity we could get out of adult rats. And there's a video clip showing an intermediate experiment where we wanted to see if we could create a new sense in rats, adult rats.
You need a sense in addition to the five senses?
Yes,
okay.
In addition to the regular common senses, this is an animal that learned to touch otherwise invisible light. Infrared, as most of you know, mammals cannot track infrared beams, humans and primates cannot. But we asked the question, can we actually get an infrared sensor in the head of these animals and get the electrical output that comes from it directly on the touch cortex, on the part of the cortex that is representing information from the face? And can you get these guys to learn to feel that invisible light as if it was some kind of tactile sense? Mm-hmm. And it turns out that they learn that. In fact, they can learn that in 3 days. So what this animal is doing is tracking a beam of infrared light, not by seeing it, but by touching it. Uh-huh. And when it gets there, it gets a drop of water as a reward.
They learn amazingly quickly.
Very quick. If you do now the same experiment by putting that output in the visual cortex, they learn in 6 hours to track that beam of invisible light. So when we saw that, we said, okay, we are ready for the big one, the big experiment. And that was building a direct linkage between 2 rats. So the first one is the encoder rat, and the second one is the decoder rat. The encoder rat does the heavy duty. So he gets a visual cue that tells him whether to bar press left or right. If he does correct, he gets a reward. Well, when he gets the light, and that's the video you're seeing, you see the left trial, there is a light that comes out, tells the encoder in red, okay, press left. When he makes the decision and press that, we get a snippet of his brain activity and sent to the second guy, who doesn't get the correct cue. He doesn't get any cue. The two lights are on. And the question is, can the second guy interpret that and press the correct lever? And in 70% of the trials, they do. So this is a right trial where he goes to the right, press the lever. Now we are sending the message to the second rat. And the second rat will say, okay, let me get that food. And he decodes the message that's coming directly to its brain and gets the food.
What's the significance of getting 70% and not 100%?
Oh, because there's some noise. And we are using, at that time, we are using just one channel transmission. We are using a poor channel communication because we had no idea what would happen. But the interesting thing is that there's a caveat in this experiment that got us thinking much deeper than we thought in the beginning. The first guy is getting reward when he bar press, but we decided to create a bonus to the first guy. So if the second gets right, the first guy gets a bonus, they have extra food. So this guy said, okay, I like that bonus. I'm from New York, I work in the financial district, I love my bonus, you know. I'm willing to do all sorts of crazy things for that bonus. No, they're not rats. I didn't say that.
I didn't say that.
Yeah, we're not guilty of that. Well, in any event, what happened is the first guy does it, but this guy, for whatever reason, the second one gets a mistake, doesn't get correct. What we noticed that instantaneously in the next trial, the first guy slows down the movement and makes it the brain signal to noise higher, almost like saying, "Can you get it now, idiot? Because I want that extra reward." And the second rat invariably get it right. And he get it right for several trials because he got the idea. So after a few trials, the first guy selects again. He does very quick and his brain to noise goes down, seeing whether the second guy can get it done.
Wow.
And that was the kind of adaptation that we didn't predict. There was some non-linear adaptation. And the second one is that the brain of the second guy, the decoder, the neurons there not only now respond to the body parts of the animal, but also to the touches of the body parts of the first animal. So two bodies are represented in one brain.
Okay.
So that wasn't predicted. We had no idea about that.
All right. Well, and in all of these cases, the animals have stuff sticking through their skulls.
Tiny stuff, yeah.
Okay, you're merciful, but
yes.
you've got to go inside.
About 2.5 millimeters. Yes.
Okay. The reason I'm bringing that up, I want to move down to your two colleagues now from Washington State, Chantel and Andrea. And first of all, you two work together in the same lab, but you know each other pretty well, right?
Yeah. We met a few times. We met here in New York, actually, 9 years ago.
How long have you been married?
7.
So you work all day in the lab and you see each other in the house the rest of the time.
Yeah,
we keep working.
Yeah.
And we work all night at the house. Sometimes.
So I'm curious, very briefly from each of you, just a little biographically, how you got into the field in the first place.
Sure. Well, one thing I'll say about how I met Andrea, this might surprise you all, but we don't get out much, scientists. So it's very convenient when you have a tall, dark, and handsome Italian man working down the hall from you at Carnegie Mellon, and the rest is history, as it were. I actually started pre-med at UC San Diego, and I was really deep into these accelerated pre-med classes, and I had to take one social science class and one social science requirement left before I was ready to go on to med school. And I took an intro psych class, intro to psychology. And I was exposed to what I now know an inaccurate version of the Phineas Gage story, this man who had a railroad spike blown through his frontal lobe. And the sort of Psych 101 level story of this is that he changed. Mm-hmm. This brain injury changed him and changed his personality. And it occurred to me that this organ is us. This tangle of neurons in our heads is us. And that was it for me. I was over. I did not want to go to med school. I wanted to be a neuroscientist. I majored in psychology and I started working in a child development lab, and there I fell in love with the idea of individual differences. So we were studying the brains of 6-month-old, 9-month-old, 12-month-old children as they learn language, and looking at how the brain changes across these levels. But I was struck by how different the 12-month-olds were from one another, and the 9-month-olds were from one another. And most of what we do is kind of comparing groups of people, but from that moment, it was very clear to me that these kids were different within ages, and that their brains were different
You
because
study
of it.
one at a time.
Yeah,
One at a time.
individual differences is really what I'm
How
passionate about.
about you, Andrea?
So I got into the field of neuroscience. Actually, I took the scenic route to it. I actually started doing business marketing as an undergraduate, and then I didn't like it, so I decided to take a computer science class. And at the time, I didn't even own a computer. However, it turned out that it was very good. It was very fun for me, and it was good, so I learned how to program a computer. And eventually, I decided that my undergraduate project was going to be in artificial intelligence. And midway through, I discovered there was an entire field in artificial intelligence which is called machine learning, programming computers to be smart and intelligent, flexible like we are. And I discovered that a lot of this research comes from taking inspiration from how the brain works. And the idea that I could program a machine and create a tiny working version of the brain on my little laptop or desktop at the time, I thought it was such a bizarre thing that it could be something that could be like perceiving a world and reasoning about the world inside the machine. And this idea kind of never left me. What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be thinking? And so I decided that I needed to get into that, and I decided to eventually graduate, get a PhD, and then move to Carnegie Mellon. And then at Carnegie Mellon, I found this beautiful, smart scientist who was working down the road from me, and then at that point, I had no reason to ever leave this field, right?
So you're in this lab now. Why don't you tell us what, first of all, I made the distinction with Miguel's work where he's putting things through the skull. You work from the outside.
That's right.
You do not cross the skin barrier.
Right, so we work with healthy humans, and for whatever reason, they don't let us stick things into their brains. So we've got to do things safely and non-invasively, and it's great, actually. It turns out that there's quite a lot that you can do.
So tell us the work that we're going to be talking about. We're going to show a video in a little bit, but tell us about it first, and we'll look at the video. And you can join in, Andrea, on this.
Absolutely.
So I like to say that I was the puppet master in the first non-invasive human brain-to-brain interface. And in this demo that you're going to see, we actually did was link two of our colleagues, Rajesh Rao, who was across campus at the University of Washington in computer science, and Andrea Sacco, my husband, was the first receiver of this non-invasive human brain-to-brain. And what we did essentially was use a similar technology to what Miguel has been talking about, human brain-computer interface, to detect in the sender the intention to move his hand. So Dr. Rao was across campus in computer science, and he was actually watching a video game. But he didn't have any way of interacting with the video game. So he had no joystick. He just had a video game in which airplanes or missiles fly by. And what Dr. Rao needed to do, so you can see Dr. Rao on the left, we're recording his EEG. What he needed to do is think about moving his hand. He couldn't move his hand at all. He needed to just think about moving his hand to press a button. That's the EEG lighting up there, and he's sitting in a very comfortable chair getting ready. And there's Andrea, and like a good wife, I'm getting ready to stimulate his brain. You can see his hand is over the joystick, essentially. And what I'm doing is I'm positioning a magnetic coil that has the property of inducing a focal electrical current in the brain. I'm positioning it right over his hand area. So when the computer detected that Dr. Rao wanted to hit the button when a missile was flying over, as you can see there, it would travel across the internet, and it would turn on our TMS machine, which would then cause Andrea's hand to move. So essentially, Andrea was the world's first human Wiimote in this experiment.
That was your Neil Armstrong moment.
Yeah. And it was great. It was very exciting to be there. I think Dr. Rao got a little overexcited. He was shooting everything that flies, even if it was a plane.
Let's run the video again. What we're looking for then, Andrea, is to see your. I mean, it's subtle, but we're looking for your finger to move.
Yeah, there's a moment. It's very. It basically passes in just a millisecond. But there's a moment where I actually receive stimulation and my hand moves. It's a very subtle impulse that passes through my brain. In fact, this is like probably the second or third demo that we did, but in the first time I didn't even realize that my hand had moved. We can reach a level of control that is quite subtle, reaching only.
So there it is, right there.
Okay, so tell us what you were feeling at that point. And again, just to make clear, there's that round donut-shaped metal object above your head. That's beaming in a magnetic signal.
That's correct.
Which is triggered by a computer, which is triggered by the signals from Dr. Rao's brain.
That's correct. This is actually the very first time this happened. I still remember this was August in 2013, the first time we actually made it work. I was there, and actually I was just waiting for something to happen, but because humans tend to be a little bit aware of their experiments, and we want to make sure that everything is working without humans knowing what's going on. I was kind of like in an isolated chamber. I had no idea what was going on. Everything was behind me. The experimenters were all behind me. I had noise cancellation earphones, so I couldn't even hear the tiny clicks that this machine makes.
That was a detail I left out. You couldn't see or hear the game.
Anything. This way they were sure that actually when I was moving my hand, I was moving because the system had controlled my hand. We actually know now that this impulse is so much faster than any voluntary movement I could have made. Anyway, I was there, and I remember wondering all the time, when is it going to happen? Am I going to feel anything? Is it going to work? Is it ever going to work? And I remember very clear at a certain point, I didn't realize that I moved my hand, but I had the idea that people were moving around, and I could hear Chantal's laugh. Chantal's laugh.
Oh, you can hear her laugh.
Yeah. And I realized it must have worked.
That was my YouTube fame. We have like 1 million hits on YouTube, and it's just my cackling in the background while they do this.
Actually, it would have been cooler if what you heard in your head was Dr. Rao's voice in a movie saying, "Shoot the plane." Shoot the plane. Because that's what, when this is carried to fruition, I'm sure this is going to be happening. So what's your next experiment?
Our next experiment, we have actually a bunch of experiments we are working on at the same time. There is one thing that I want to make clear, though, that different from what Miguel is doing with rats, the capabilities of transmitting information non-invasively are much more limited. Our machines are safe. We don't need to open up the skull. Mm-hmm. But what we can exactly do is pretty limited, and we're still learning how to develop these machines, develop better technologies. So Chic here is actually working actively to improving these technologies one order of magnitude possibly in the future. And we're learning how to control exactly how we control the impulses, how we get impulses into the brain, so that we reproduce the exact patterns of activity that we want the brain to be into.
Do you need everybody's brains to be basically mappable exactly the same way for that to work?
No. But this is actually a really interesting question, and this is where Chantal's work is so important, because brains are different from each other. And this is actually one of the biggest problems that we found. That we need to be accurate in what we stimulate and how precise that we do that.
You were telling me a story about you and your daughter playing.
Yes, so the second experiment. So a lot of people asked Andrea, what was it like? What do you feel? And as he's alluded, this transmission was from an intention to move the hand to something like a reflex. So it's not that Andrea felt the urge to move his hand. We just twitched it directly through the brain. And in the second experiment, we wanted to transmit conscious information. So in the second experiment, the receiver actually saw a flash of light and used that to make a decision. It was a really fun experiment because essentially what happened was we turned our family road trip game into a brain-to-brain experiment. So hopefully some of you in the audience have played something like 20 questions or guess what animal I'm thinking about. And in this experiment, I was actually paired with my 21-year-old daughter, as we were one of the teams here. And you can see one of our friends and subjects receiving information in this experiment. So what we did was the sender in this experiment selected an object from a set of possible objects. And then the receiver asked a question: is it living or non-living? Is it, large or small? Is it edible? They asked, there were options on the screen. And then what our sender did was looked at an item, either yes or no on the video screen, and the computer could detect whether they were looking at yes and no using information from the visual cortex. If the answer was yes, the receiver saw a flash of light, and that let them answer the question, go through a series of questions until they could figure out which object on the array people were thinking of.
Wow.
You see here that the cord is different. This is actually a cord that we're using that is much more focal and is positioned on the back of the part of the brain that usually interprets signals from the eyes. And in this case, we're actually bypassing the eyes altogether and injecting signals straight into this part of the brain. The brain interprets as something that is outside in the world, a light, a flash. Some people see lines hanging over and over in the visual field. And this is enough to transmit this binary information.
Where to a sort of lay journalist like myself, or maybe to a lay member of the audience, where there's a sense of letdown about your work doing is, in fact, we do want to hear that your work is having the voice in the brain say, shoot the plane. But what you're actually doing, what the stage you're at, is more like you're pushing buttons, you're firing triggers. Is that correct? But you're also saying that that's a huge deal. And so what is the case that it's a huge deal?
Well, first of all, in this second experiment and in the subsequent experiments, people are learning to interpret. They see a light, so it's not just a button; it's a conscious experiment. And what we've seen is like Miguel's experiment, where the rats learn and they're sort of dynamic. Humans, they're learning to see something that's not in front of them. They're learning to see by stimulating the brain directly. And so I think that in and of itself is really interesting.
That's gigantically. So, Sheikh, let's. Did you have another thing?
Just a brief thing. There is this kind of idea that I would like to dispel a little bit. People imagine brain-to-brain communication as the X-Men version of telepathy, where you hear this tiny voice in your head that is somebody else's thoughts. This is questionable because, in the first place, if your thoughts were actually projected to me and transmitted to my brain would have no way of knowing that they are yours. They will think they are my own brain. But more deeply, our thoughts are not really this internal voice. We kind of perceive some of them as an internal voice, but our thoughts are this kind of changes in what we perceive and feel and what we imagine. And we know from neuroscience that we oscillate between different states. Focusing on a task and then wandering out, for instance, is something that we do spontaneously. So whatever shape, whatever technology let us do in terms of brain-to-brain communication is probably going to be very different, and in many ways much more interesting than this idea we can listen to somebody's tape recordings in the head.
So you also are non-invasive. You use focused ultrasound, but the thing that you're right now most famous for is human to animal brain connection. Tell us your work. First, how did you get into the brain business?
Yes, so the first time that I got into business of brain, it was back in mid-90s. And back then, there's a new technology that came out that's supposed to translate how our brain works. It is called functional magnetic resonance imaging, in short, fMRI. So back then, the problem that we had was, in order to analyze the data, it took about minutes to hours, typically. So as a project, what I did was I made it run faster. How fast? Instead of minutes and hours, seconds. That's how fast we made it. So, well, then after that, it came out, we found there's a lot of other applications that we can spawn out of it. So, for instance, if you have ability to analyze someone's brain function in real time, what would you do? One of the things that we did was to use someone's brain activity in real time and use that as a feedback information. So this is just an analogy. If you want to improve your golf swing, if there's any avid golfer here, you want to videotape your golf swing and probably use that information to improve your golf swing. So same analogy, you can probably use how your brain functions in real time and use that information to gain a volitional control of your brain thoughts. Isn't it kind of counterintuitive in a way? Isn't your brain is what you are doing, right? The way I speak is what my brain tells me to do. But some cases, additional help is needed. But anyway, so we use that technology to improve attention level from some of the subjects, as well as we devise the method and strategy to help regain the rehab strategy for the patient who is recovering from stroke. That's one of the things. But then I started to realize that I really wanted to do more than just mapping the brain function. deep inside of me was telling me you should do something more than just mapping the brain function. Then I had a really lucky break in a moment, in a way. About 9 years ago, I had an opportunity to work with scientists in the same division that has a really good expertise in developing focused ultrasound technology. So what it is we can deliver acoustic energy that is in ultrasound frequencies, which is you cannot hear the ultrasound, right? So it's typically more than 20,000 hertz, so you can hear them. But you can give those energy, acoustic waves that are being focused across the skull and give it to a very small area of the brain. How small it be? It's typically elongated rice grain size, to up to about a kidney bean size. That's how small it can be. So we were able to demonstrate by giving the pulsed acoustic wave into the brain tissue and can modulate, which means you can either stimulate or suppress the regional brain function through the animal model. So come to think about it. So if you have ability to stimulate the brain, it means usually what we do is we let the computer control it. So what it means is you actually have a computer to brain interface relative as to brain to computer interface that is supposed to analyze your brain function and give it to and relate it to the computer to do something else, like a robotic control or the playing games and stuff. Well, by having that ability, we were able to first demonstrate what about having human thoughts to control the animal brain function. So we used EEG technology to translate the human thought process to stimulate the brain area of the rat that are responsible for twitching the rat tail. So that's one of the first demonstrations that we did. And after that, as the video will show you, we divided the experiment into different sections, senders and receivers. And sender typically sit in front of the computer screen, and the person just look at the target that appears left or right on the computer screen. By looking at it, and the sender engages a imagination of moving, clenching either left or the right hand, depending on where the target appears on the screen. And then EEG picks up the changes in EEG signals and determines which of the left or right command that the senders are generating. And upon detecting that signal, then we transmit the information through the internet to another computer that are located about 15 miles away. And that computer actuates this focused ultrasound machine that stimulate either left or right hemisphere of the motor area, sensory area of the person who is receiving the information. So typical sensation that receivers receive is a little tingling sensation that actually happens in either right or left hand. So upon having the sensation, the receiver let others know by clenching their in this case, his right or left hand. So what actually happened was we were able to transmit at least 2 degrees of freedoms in thought processes, and then we classified it, and it was able to transmit to the other person. And how fast we can do it? We were able to transmit about 8 to 9 commands, different commands, in about 1 minute. So it's not really blazingly fast, but by basically the brain thought process and communication, it's pretty good feature that we had.
Mm-hmm. Is the actual content of the receivers? Does the receiver need to be thinking about motion in order to stimulate? Could the motion, or could you set it up so that the receiver is thinking about a cheese sandwich and that stimulates motion if you program things that way?
Right. So this is very intriguing question. So the content of the information that you can transmit is still very limited. It's very rudimentary. So it's either in imagining moving your left or right hand that much. And the person who receives it is a tingling sensation that actually happened either right or left hand. That's about it. So the amount of the content of the information that you receive is still limited.
Joe, of everything you've heard so far, what's leaping out at you as either fascinating or let's be wary or let's not oversell?
Well, I think a little bit of all of that. I think the notion of the rats learning from each other, it has implications for education. A teacher trying to educate a student who's not getting it. Is there a way of amplifying the signal in real time in a classroom? So this is not just in a laboratory. It may have applications in places we don't generally think about it. On a more sort of nefarious, side of things, the work that you guys did, spectacular work. And I just want to say this is a community of scientists who have evolved generationally and amplified each other's work and complement each other's work. We talk about science.
Very short.
Yeah, and we talk about science being competitive, but it's also a collaboration. It is a community. I think that's an important lesson for young people who are watching. You get more done by collaborating than competing with each other. But what I think is really, really kind of frightening and scary and exciting at the same time is that when you were pressing that button, you did not know you were pressing that button. You had we talked about volitional control. This technology can improve volitional control, but it also can be done without volition. And that brings up the issue of being controlled by some other agency, by some other entity.
That happens often.
It happens all the time, right? You're living in the media capital of the world.
Watch TV.
That's right. But it's right. The propaganda is the ultimate kind of mind control.
Yeah.
So it's not unique to neuroscience. But I think it does raise the question of the proximity of the intervention, and it's happening in your head. And let's say, we got a little more sophisticated and the technology will certainly evolve, and you have a neurological reason to have such a device, maybe to help improve your learning after a stroke, and you do something, you hit somebody. Was it you or was it the device? And how do we determine culpability and responsibility? And then the issue of embodiment. Is this you or the machine? Is it a tool that, like a blind person who has a cane who's able to, but people who have canes begin to feel that the cane is part of themselves, it's embodiment. Or does it change our sense of what's normal and what's normative? So I think that this is very exciting and work, but I think we also have to think about science and society and these broader considerations. And this seems very primitive right now, but it's going to gallop along. And as usual, we deal with the consequences after we've done the science.
Miguel, what's your response to that? And first of all, it does seem primitive, but can it move fast? And does it, the questions that does raising matter?
Well, very good questions that I have taught since the beginning. And in fact, later maybe I can show a different variation of this thing in monkeys that go to exactly to your point. Because I have three concerns about this, and they go into your line. One is exactly what you said. If one day someone may want to use this technology to make someone perform a behavior that is not the actual voluntary intention of that person. As of course is a concern that we all have. The other that I find is the central concern of neuroscience, my humble opinion right now, is the possibility of the weaponization of the brain.
It's like a drone.
Yeah, exactly. Creating weapons that are based on these concepts of brain-machine interfaces of brain-to-brain, because I'm against it. I don't want to see that happening. And I think the neuroscience community has to be aware of these issues and start debating them, because it's very easy to get enamored by the technology and not thinking about it. But the other thing I wanted to just point out is the fact that, yes, it can get sophisticated very quickly. It can.
Does everybody agree with that?
I'm talking about from the point of view of neuroscience from inside the brain, not necessarily invasive. In animals, you can demonstrate much more sophisticated mental collaboration. That's what I had a video that I brought of where 3 monkeys learn to mentally collaborate.
If you can get 3 animals collaborating, could you get 100 collaborating?
Yeah, sure, that's the point. I actually call this construct an organic computer. You have 3 monkeys that don't know that they're in the lab. They don't know the existence of their companions. And they have to move a virtual arm in 3D continuous. This is several bits of information per second. But one monkey mentally, without moving his own body, only controls the X and Y dimension of their movement. The first monkey controls X and Y mentally. The second monkey controls Y and Z, and the third one X and Z. So for that arm to move in 3D, you need at least two monkeys to perfectly synchronize their brains. And there's a computer that is getting these recordings from the three brains to make this behave like an entity, a single entity. And this is the setup. So you have three monkeys. Each one is controlling 2 dimensions of this three-dimensional movement. And you need to get them synchronized. So what you see here now, the color circles represent the output of each one of the monkey's brains, 2D output. The black dot is the linear combination of these three animals' brains done by a computer. And they, to get reward, they have to put a black body inside that big target.
And they're seeing the what? They're seeing the
They
target.
are seeing just the target and the dimension that they control mentally. Well, these animals stop moving. They synchronize their brains at a 10 millisecond resolution. So the outcome of this is that from 300 neurons in each animal, we created a 900 neuron brain that is actually doing the task. And the monkeys are getting reward and juice. And they get better, better, better. This is to a point where you may see in a point, a monkey gets a little nap. The blue guy went a nap a moment ago. The two other guys, without even knowing that there are other monkeys in the room, they take the slack. They increase the synchron in their brains because they want that juice.
So what do you see with the idea of networking?
Right.
Dozens and dozens of rehearsal. You're gonna need a lot of juice.
I did a lot of oranges. Of the Brazilian version. Yeah. Well, we can see in the next movie what I envision for the future, because it's already happening in our lab in Brazil, in São Paulo, where we did the World Cup, and we are still working on those patients. The beginning of training using non-invasive EEG to control an axle takes several weeks. The patients, they don't have the concept of walking anymore. And we noticed that that was the most difficult part of their training. So what we did here was to pair, using the same brain net concept that you saw in monkeys, we pair a paraplegic patient with a physical therapist. And we are merging their EEG activity linearly, but giving a higher weight to the normal brain of the physical therapist. So our theory here is that we may enhance the speed, we may increase the speed of training, because this paraplegic guy is getting correct feedback since the beginning. He's getting it right. But he's only contributed 10%, while the physical therapist is contributing 90%. And as time goes by, we are increasing the weight of the paraplegic and reducing the weight of the physical therapist. And we are just measuring this now. We don't know the answer.
I was going to ask with what results?
Yeah, well, our expectation is that we are going to reduce the time that it takes for a paraplegic patient to regain the concept of having legs and being able to control them mentally, so they can move to the exoskeleton faster.
I think that's brilliant. I think that's wonderful, not only because it's great science, but because it also reflects one of the slogans of the disability community is there's nothing about us without us.
Yeah.
And you've included these people in the process. And again, that's educational and it's also collaborative, because I'm sure there's other kinds of communication about their needs and their desires and their problems and the challenges they're facing. So I think that's a great merge of what you need as individuals, as human beings, our differences, our personalities, our disabilities, plus how to bring the science together. That's a great synthesis.
Yeah, what they tell us is that most of physical rehabilitation, the classical one, is passive. Right. You're there, and a physical therapist is trying to move your leg, and you're just there, receiving that. In this kind of thing, you're a protagonist.
But I think actually this is like a key point. I think that all of us were sharing stories of being given slack because people believe that some of our research is just scientists playing fancy video games using each other controllers, or having a rat being a controller. It is not. So we start, and we need to start small, and sometimes we play around with scenarios that are intentionally a bit theoretic because they are simple to control. But what we see is actually ways in which we can possibly help people recover function faster than now. And this is something that needs to be kept in mind, as Miguel was saying.
No pun intended.
Exactly. As Miguel was saying, most of neurorehabilitation is based on techniques that are centuries old. But essentially, it means that once you have a problem, you need to go back to square one and relearn how to move like a child.
Yeah.
But imagine that we can record your brain activity, keep it on a hard drive, and then when you have a stroke, we can use those signals to train your brain backwards.
So that's not what I was going to say. Good job, Matt. Fail. I was actually going to say something that everybody said, but not specifically, is that a lot of people are worried that someone else is going to control your brain. But a lot of what we're hearing is actually people learning how to control their own brains better. And I think that's actually really exciting because whether you believe it or not, I believe that your brain is you and is controlling you anyway. So becoming explicitly aware and learning about your own brain function and learning to control your brain, I think is important and exciting and has a lot of implications.
So that's actually a very interesting story. Well, I'd like to bring up the following issue as well. So I really get a lot of questions about, well, Smshik, you have this great tool, so what do you want to do with it? I usually bring up all the good things I would like to do. For instance, I want to go out and modulate the brain area that has been associated with substance abuse or psychiatrical diseases and so on. If someone has a memory problem, I really want to help them out by, for instance, activating or invigorating the function of the hippocampus and so on. But then the same person asks me the following question. I usually have to stop and think about it. What if you flip that tools around toward the bad one? For instance, if you intended to modulate the, for instance, nucleus accumbens, the small little brain area that is associated with the pleasure of the brain, exactly, and that it is associated with addiction, substance abuse. What if you start to start it instead of curing it? That's another scary thing. What if you start to improve, instead of improving the memory, if you start to modulate and change the memory, what's going to happen? That's always the question that kind of bothers my mind and lingers over.
Miguel, you were going to say something, I think?
No, I think it's also important, given the points you raised, that we emphasize that I don't think we will ever be able to broadcast from one brain to another things that we consider the essence of the human condition. Because these things are not trivial. They're emergent properties of circuits, huge circuits, and we don't even know how to record those things, let alone broadcast them and make someone else interpret that thing. So the brain is not a digital computer. It's not a machine that you can get the program out and replicate on another machine. There is much more into the brain, and I actually think that there are analog components that make us human. We live to create analogies, metaphors, to expect things, to predict things, and these things are not reducible to the kind of algorithms, machine learning algorithms that we all use. So that fear, I think we can calm down. We are not going to be broadcasting your dreams to my head, nor my soccer preferences to his Italian head, which would be very dangerous. Very dangerous. Yeah.
Joe, do you agree with that? That the unlikelihood of that sort of level?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a risk of science fiction, getting everybody petrified so we don't have any kind of advance. And the hyperbole, is something we want to be careful about because then legitimate uses get undermined because people are petrified and concerned. But I do think that we have to have a regulatory structure that doesn't quelch the creativity of these great scientists, but at the same time, make sure there are issues of informed consent, that institutional review boards know what they're regulating, that the FDA is responsible in their oversight for the development of new devices. I mean, there are issues besides.
But that would be true with virtually any kind of research.
Yeah,
I'm wondering are you talking about special sets of concerns? For example, one that I've read quite a bit about in relation to this would be privacy. If there's communication between brains.
I mean, like Dick Cheney, for example, when he had his implantable defibrillator, turned off the wireless function for fear that he'd be defibrillated and hacked. I mean, so in red states and blue states, perhaps. So I think there's some concern, but I think one of the differences, and this is I think a problem with the FDA, is that it's really focused on drugs, and the devices are so much more heterogeneous and more complicated, and there's so much innovation. A drug is a drug. There are differences, or minor differences, and those minor differences make a big difference. But devices are sometimes sui generis. So the regulatory structure seems to lag behind the innovation, and sometimes there's premature closure. And there's a real problem. We talk about all these wonderful possibilities, they talk about the valley of death. You have proof of principle, and you can't get market support, financial support to bring it to the bedside. And that's been something that the Brain Initiative, the Obama Brain Initiative, had a meeting last year. Many of us were talking about how do you overcome that valley of death so innovation gets to the bedside.
Do you all feel under pressure to be able to frame your work as ultimately having practical value and putting in the framework of innovation, as opposed to the fact that you're actually just you're discovering? If you like discovery for its own sake, you're doing some pretty darn interesting discovery for its own sake. You're all nodding like I pushed a button in your brain. I mean, do you feel that if we weren't putting these questions to you about practical applications, would you be thinking about them that much?
There is this divide between the reasons that motivate deep inside us, which sometimes are not clear to us. Why did we start studying the mind? Mostly because I thought it was the most fascinating thing. I would have sold a kidney to keep studying brains for the rest of my life. And there is this sense of
I know
responsibility.
he sold his brain to keep studying kidneys.
Stopped. That was a problem. And on the other hand, we are very well aware, and Chantal and I talk about it a lot, that as scientists, we are extremely privileged. We have what we consider the most beautiful job in the world.
Why?
And, well, because it's exciting every day. It's like I get my rush of dopamine every day by going to the lab and see what my students do.
We're pursuing the truth, and you could be the first person in the world to know
I
something.
don't even think it's that. I think the beautiful part of it is that we are paid to be kids forever.
Yeah.
That is actually the truth.
We are paid to touch things that normal people would say, no, this is not an adult kind of thing. You're going there for the passion of discovery.
You really feel that way?
I the only reason.
You never get bored.
I once told my sister that for me it's like being 8 years old and being given an infinite room full of Legos. And that's actually the feeling that I have every morning when I get to the lab. And it's beautiful. On the other hand, there are people who generously, pay taxes and do donations to maintain this going. So it's a skill that goes both ways. Of course, I would do it by myself in my garage if I didn't have this job. But since there are these standing opportunities on, I think it's more than right. That
But for you, you would have to be doing this work. In other words, you could be studying the kidney, and there are probably discoveries being made about the kidney, but you're not interested in the kidney.
I'm not interested in the kidney.
The kidney, yeah.
Just
It's got to be the brain.
No, not the kidney.
So it's that thing. It's Chantal said, this is who we are. The brain is.
Yeah, I mean, at least that's the thing. I'm sure there are people that are exactly as fascinated with the brain as I am, and they're fascinated about kidneys.
And I hope there are people studying the kidney.
Exactly. I hope people study kidneys like that.
And the liver time.
We have a lot of questions coming in from audience members that are reaching me via iPad, and some are from Twitter, and some are coming through YouTube. One question I like: how long do you think it will be before we can download knowledge directly into our brains? I guess it depends on what you mean by knowledge,
Correct.
but
Never.
You're saying never?
Never.
Why?
Because knowledge is a transform of information that only the brain can produce, and we have no idea how to reproduce the non-linear emergent property in the brain. So we're never going to sit in a room with a TMS machine and learn French if you're, not a native speaker.
But you can rewire. I mean, you can, like your reps are learning to do things.
No, they're learning things.
And when they learn, it changes their brain.
If
But
I
it's not.
understood the question is
Pre-existing
again, the
knowledge.
Britannica
Algebra.
encyclopedia, and put this down in my head. I don't think that ever will happen.
I disagree, not because I believe that this is an area that we can envision easily, but because I believe that information and knowledge varies on a degree.
So something very simple.
Yeah, something very simple, like
sure.
pure vision information is something that we can control to a certain extent.
No, I was taking to the limit.
And
Well, the questioner doesn't specify, but you had said before, maybe if you could download your way of knowing how to walk, and then later in life after a stroke you need it again. I suppose you can call that knowledge. It's not book knowledge. It's not poetry.
More
it's from knowledge, yeah.
More than knowledge. It's just
More,
So never say that never.
yeah, I don't think so.
So yeah, I totally agree that the downloading entire memory, like what you've seen in the movie, may not be that possible. But if you make a very, very simplified version out of it, I think you will be able to.
But certainly not wisdom.
Exactly.
But we should give credit to a guy named Arthur Clarke, who back in the 70s wrote a book, the final book of the trilogy, 3001. And the book starts with something called the brain cap. And people are learning knowledge about the universe, languages, and everything by hooking, a brain cap to someone that is very wise, broadcasting that to someone that is not so wise. And Arthur Clarke wrote a space science fiction novel in which half of the book is about these brain caps. So it's very interesting to see the way back. Science fiction writers of that magnitude, one of the greatest, was using the brain as a frontier.
He also brought us how.
Yes. How? Yeah.
Is there any fear of brain function alteration from focused US or ultrasound, I think is what it means, focused ultrasound or magnetic stimulation in your subjects? Is there any fear of brain function alteration? In other words, I think, can these experiments hurt your subjects?
So functional alteration, I think it's a little obscure to me, but if I want to add on a little bit, it's a very difficult question. It's a good question though. I think there is a possibility. So it really depends how you're going to use them wisely.
So yeah, it's a level thing. So every single experience changes your brain. So clearly, if we stimulate a part of your brain, it changes your brain. The question is, how significant is that one single stimulation in terms of every other microsecond of your brain? Transcranial magnetic stimulation is a tool that is FDA approved and is used in clinical situations such as to treat depression and so forth and so on. And again, depending on the way it's used, not the way we use it, but you can create these temporary downregulations of parts of the brain that sometimes, again, helps when that part of the brain is getting in the way of your everyday functioning. We're very careful. So to the extent that we know how long-lasting these effects are, we're very careful. We deliver one stimulation approximately 20 seconds, which makes our experiments really slow. It's a good thing they're playing a game in between.
Did he change?
Yeah, of course.
Did he change after you?
Yeah.
No,
I've been doing a lot at home too, just dishes. The dish cortex is really
This is
strong.
better,
Yeah. I'm still waiting for funding from NIH for that.
Right, so simply put, we believe it will change it, but we haven't gone that far yet.
Well, in deep brain stimulation, which has been used, investigationally for therapeutics for Parkinson's disease, people have had improved learning as well as motor improvement. For the treatment of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, it actually dampens out those symptoms. And there's some real pioneering work for depression. And I just add, one of the things that's really interesting is that there are different places in the brain that you can target that have variable effects on depression, which gets to the individual differences, the variability, and also the fact that these circuits are immensely complicated. So the one advantage of DBS, or getting directly into the brain, notwithstanding all the risk-benefit issues, is that you can target something, whereas transcranial or external stimulation is a bigger window of activation, and maybe more superficial.
We've made this distinction between the work that you're doing where you're actually putting probes into the brain, and yours, all three of you are doing outside. It's almost stereotype cliche of the crazy guy saying they put a chip in my brain, but
it will happen. We have already 30,000 people more, 80,000 people with chips in the cochlea, which is pretty close.
Well,
we have the 100,000 DPS.
But in the context of what we're talking about, or are we in that context already?
Can I tell you just very quickly a story? When I was in medical school, the first pacemakers, heart pacemakers, got to Brazil in the 70s, late 70s. It was a big thing and required open heart surgery at that time to put one of those things. And my professor of cardiothoracic surgery went to a guy on Friday, and the guy didn't want to do it, and he was about to have a serious condition at that point. He had a very bad arrhythmia, and the guy said, "No, this is too big. I don't want to put in my heart." And my professor said, "Do you want to watch that soccer game on Sunday at the end of the championship?" He said, "Oh, absolutely. I put money on it." I said, "Let's put this pacemaker on your heart." And he got it. He lived years. I don't know how long. I didn't follow him. But now, a heart pacemaker, is the size of a fingernail.
Really?
You make it through an artery. depositing in here, I don't know how many people, but it's close to more millions probably. You don't know that the guy had a heart pacemaker. It's really tiny, very safe, and it has saved millions of lives. So as technology evolved, and as we know more about the brain, I have no doubt that in decades, for different conditions, of course, epilepsy, Parkinson's, or other things, we will have the tiny implants that we don't even know that the patient has. And it's going to be all wireless. There's nothing coming out of the head. It's going to be like the heart.
I agree. And there's right now the distinction between invasive technologies, like what Miguel is doing, and non-invasive technologies, like what we use, is very obvious. The technologies look different, they feel different, they apply different, they reach different parts of the brain. But you can envision very easily things that go in between. Even with the most obvious and safe and now consumer distributed non-invasive recording technology, which is EEG, you can imagine just tiny things that will go under your skin and will give you a better signal than what we can get now. You can imagine things that will go inside your skull and could be implanted and you could actually just reach inside and would be absolutely painless. Sorry. Painful-lessness. And we could go on. And there are technologies that go in between the skull and the brain. They don't quite touch the brain, they don't hurt the brain, but let you stimulate and record brain activity with a level of precision that is unimaginable until a few years back.
Joe, does that change the calculus at all in terms of ethical questions or legal questions?
Actually, I think one of the ongoing issues right now for some of the deep brain stimulation trials are people who were implanted that had good effect, and companies go out of business, and they're still implanted. And they want to continue to receive the intervention for the stimulation. And so I think we have to really think, sort of broadly about our ongoing obligation to these folks. The other thing that's been happening with deep brain stimulation, despite all this very promising work, it's been a lot of trials have been considered failures. And they've been considered failures because the device companies only follow people for a certain amount of time, or they set arbitrary limits about what constitutes success. So 20% of people have to have an effect within a certain period of time. But then there are people who have a positive effect after the trial is over. And what about the 10 or 12% that have an effect? We should be learning from our successes and not deeming our failures because it really truncates the science. And I just wrote a piece in neurosurgery about using the information that we learn from trials to iterate. And once you're implanted, we should be using the opportunity to try to maximize the effectiveness because the economic investment is there, the burden on the patient is there, and the market forces determine what success is, but the science should really drive the discovery. And I think that's a really important issue to put all this into the real world context.
Oh, this is a great home stretch question. The director of the documentary film Mastermind, #Brain, #Tech, who's here in the audience tonight. Thanks for joining us wherever you are. Question is, what are your goals for brain-to-brain communication in the next 5 years? Why don't you just take a minute, go down the line. Let's come this way, and we'll start with you, Sanjay.
All right, so I really love that question. I'd like to ask the audience. You're gonna see my name on the website, so you can always email me. I'd like to ask you the following question. So this is what I can do, and probably this is something we can do. You can send 2 informations, either left or right, up and down, yes or no kind of question. This is something that is really feasible even right now. And let's assume the example that I showed you is in one direction. There was a sender, there was a receiver. But we can make it bidirectional. So I can send you the information, you can send that information to me. Other dimension. Let's make it 1 to many and many to 1. Now let's add another dimension here. Many to many. That's the other dimension. So if with those framework, what would you do? I'd love to hear the answer. And I'm just gonna leave my answer blank.
That's a good one.
It's a very smart question. The answer.
Andrea.
So, my biggest goal in the next 5 years would be to be able really to transmit information that is non-binary but continuous and a bit more richer than sensory motor information. And sensory motor information is the thing that we understand best about the brain. we really have beautiful models of how information is encoded. And we know, and we are learning at least, even with non-invasive technologies, how to control this information to a certain degree. But when I look at the idea of downloading a Wikipedia page, I see all the reasons why this is unrealistic, but I also know that people who work on how knowledge is represented, they believe that ultimately all the knowledge that we have is an abstraction of how we interact with the world. Knowledge comes from the fact that we have a body, and our body is our interface to get information from the world and put information out there. And they believe this is a layer of complexity. If in the next 5 years I can move from this tiny layer here, which is just like what I can feel on the skin, moving a finger and seeing a line over and over in the visual field, to one level above it, and I actually had no idea how this level could be, but could be like a complex movement or the idea of a movement, that I would consider a huge scientific success.
I'm really interested in brain states. So as I said in the beginning, I'm really interested in individual differences. And one thing we know is that certain people are better learners than others. And one of the things that says whether someone's going to be a good learner is whether they tune in or pay attention at the place when critical information is being delivered. We're working on, there are EEG characteristics of zoning out or focusing or paying attention that we can detect. So we're working on linking a sort of tutor-learner model together in which we could upregulate attention in one person when the good learner starts to focus. So brain states in general, I think, also have a lot of potential for improving communication. At the root, I'm really interested in language. I think it's one of the most complex things we do. And a lot of the big technological advances have been centered on communicating better, right? The telegraph, the internet, et cetera. But imagine if I could not only send words, but send some affect, some basic affect, like I'm nervous or I'm relaxed, some other piece of state of mind with my words. I think that could be really, really advanced communication.
Yeah.
Well, in animals, I think we are going to continue to pursue the idea of building organic computers. I'm very curious about linking brains together because I think it happens in nature and it has accelerated over the last 300 years in our species because of media, different types of media that allow us to link through the internet, television, radio waves, whatever it is. So I'm very curious because I think brains, individual brains and connected brains compute in a very profound, different way than digital machines do. So I want to study the basic computational laws of these organic computers as a more abstract thing. From a more applied way, I want to create brain nets with patients. They're either spinal cord injury patients or stroke patients, aphasic patients, patients that have a neurological deficit, and see if you can stimulate plasticity or recovery like we saw in the spinal cord injury, because we used non-invasive in there and it worked very well. So, and that's one point I'd like to make. For different disorders, you may take advantage of non-invasive methods because they're fine. And for others, like lock-in syndrome, for instance, people that cannot move any muscle, you may need to get into the brain. So I want to see if brain nets from a clinical point of view can be generalized as a new therapy for rehabilitating neurological circuits in different kinds of pathologies.
Well, you have been fascinating, and you have also been superb at explaining this to regular folks like me, and you have excited us for the future. And Joe, you have given us context, a sense of wariness, also a sense of adventure and excitement about this as well. Thank you all. Thank you for the questions. And thank you.